what I'd like to do is, again, this is, I think, for our audience, I think we'd like to understand why podiatry and then how you got to become a podiatrist. Right. I'd like to finally introduce you to Derek Santos. Now, Derek is slightly different, again, podiatrist, but he's going to talk about where his route has taken him. So, Derek, what was your armed forces career? And where are you and what are you doing now? And I think your sign behind you is a bit of a giveaway, but we'll go with that.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Paul. In terms of my journey into the profession, it was in a way of a mix between Saul and Ian. So I'm a bit of a mix between both. In terms of the forces, my experience in the forces was quite short-lived through injury. I joined about 40 years ago, which is, I was told to think about when I joined and left, and it was a long time ago. And to put things in context, when I trained with the SLR, SMG, and as I say, a webbing used to fall apart. We had to use, bungees to hold it together, and it used to get wet and things. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, you need to look back at the history books, So it was a while ago. I was born in Gibraltar, and I left school at 18. I did my O levels and A levels. Didn't know what to do with my life at the time, so I worked in a supermarket, and at the time I joined the TA and I joined the Royal Gibraltar Regiment. I could have joined the air defence. They used to use a blowpipe at the time. I could have artillery 105s or infantry, and I did join the infantry, and I loved it. That was me, hooked on it. I wanted to follow a career in the military. After about a year in the TA, I went to see my recruitment officer, and I went to Limestone. I did my selection there. I went back, and did my training there. And unfortunately, my career was very short-lived. I had a fall from quite a substantial height, injured my back, and my knee took the brunt of things. And I was really in and out of hospital for quite a while. Towards the end, I had surgery in Plymouth, and I got a medical discharge through injury. I left the forces with a walking stick, and I was told I would be using that for probably the rest of my life. And in a way, that's what triggered me, to learn about health at the time. A lot of people sort of move into jobs in security, and I became a security guard at the time, and I worked in an office. I used to lock up at night, walk around, switch the radio on and read. And I started reading about my injury. There was words in anatomy that I could barely pronounce, but it was interesting. And I learned a lot about, rehab. I looked at sort of rehabilitation. I tried some other things myself, and I thought, yeah, I could do this for the rest of my life, as opposed to sitting here. And I did. So now podiatry for me, was something that happened by chance, because after doing all that, I was going to be a physio. And in those days, I went to the library and I picked up a box of physio. And then next to it, there was another leaflet that said podiatry stroke chiropody. So I really came across podiatry, and a lot of people here and a lot of my students, come across podiatry really by chance. And then they realize, oh, what's this? I could do this. As I read more about podiatry, I learned that, it was a very challenging course. I learned that, in terms of your scope of practice, you will be injecting local anesthetics. You'll be doing nail surgery, for example. You could even supply people prescribe-only drugs like antibiotics. As I found more about the profession, I learned that you can do things like working tissue viability, working diabetes. You could even, at that time, look into specializing into surgery and becoming a pediatric surgeon. There was routes to rheumatology. My interest was obviously MSK biomechanics, physical therapies, and definitely I could do that as well. So not only could I do what I was interested in at the time, but there was also scope to move into loads of other specialties. And so I did inquire about how to become a podiatrist, and unfortunately, my 2 A levels, were not science-based, so I had to then find another route. Now, my sister at the time, my sister was a GP in Scotland at the time, and we found there was a college and they had an access to health. Nowadays, you can get access to health everywhere. So, in terms of access into podiatry, college and access to health is definitely a route. So I did that. I moved over from Leeds, which when I settled, to Scotland. I went to Dunfermline, to Lauder College at the time, did my access to health. I got the GMACA trophy for that, which is like a DAX award. I then started my podiatry journey. I went to Queen Margaret University. I'm still here, many years on. So I did my undergrad here in this university. By second year, as I say, my journey was slightly different because I always liked clinical, but somehow I was drawn towards research and academia. And in level 2, when I was in year 2 of my program, I was in clinic and I had a patient. We had to do a case study. We had to choose a patient, and I had a patient that had a green toenail and had an infection. So I chose that, and it was actually Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And at the time, I got a good mark for that assignment, by the way. And my lecturer says you should publish that. And in those days, it says go to the library, get this journal, photocopy the authorship page, follow the guidelines, send it away, and I did. And that was my first paper when I was in year 2 of my undergrad, which was a Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection affecting the nail. It was a case study, and that was the title. So that was my first paper, and I was hooked into that. I've heard people talking about leprosy, Hansen's disease. Whilst I was in year 2, Dr. Hugh Cross, had just finished his PhD and had been to India, worked in leprosy, and gave us a talk, and I was hooked into it. I'm one of these people that just loves learning and will always continue. Every day is a learning day. So I was hooked on it. So I says, well, I need to find out more about leprosy. I need to go to India. So I spoke to Hugh, and he put me in touch with Bandarawala Leprosy Hospital in Pune at the time, and also with the Leprosy Mission on Lepra. As soon as I finished my final year exams in level 2, I was away to India, to a leprosy hospital. I spent all summer there, shadowing. The experience I got was amazing. I hadn't really seen ulcers at that point in time, but the experience I got in India was incredible. I was shadowing a nurse, in tissue viability. I was allowed to go into theatre and observe surgery as well, plastic surgery, orthopedic surgery. I also spent time with the orthotists that learned in level 1. Again, Ian spoke about this, about padding and strapping and making insoles. And I could make insoles to offload these ulcers, which were not healing. And unless you offload them, they're not going to heal. So I was helping out in doing these things. Came back into my level 3 undergrad. And at the time, I wanted to tell the world of my experience at the time. So I did some talks to my other students in my course. I also then presented at national level at conferences, and also international level in podiatry conferences. And also I wrote some papers on that at the time as well, whilst in level 3. And then I moved on to level 4. So I had big interest in tissue viability. However, my interest in musculoskeletal and orthopedics, came back. And for my dissertation, I looked at the effects of peak pressures. Again, Ian talked about computerized insoles. I can measure peak forces in the foot. They had just acquired in that time something called a PEDA that can do that. So I used that for my dissertation. I got in touch with professional football clubs in Scotland. Some said no, some said yes. So I went over and collected all this data and did my dissertation. And in fact, that paper, I published that paper, which was effects of peak plantar foot pressures in the foot in professional footballers. and people do not know that was actually my undergrad dissertation, and that paper still gets quoted and sometimes talked about by some colleagues who teach. So